Vivekachudamani and would really enjoy your comments on a couple of verses. It's also one of your recommended on your recommended list, reading list. So verse 267 says, even after the realization of truth, there remains a powerful beginningless vasana, that one is the doer and the enjoyer, which is the cause for rebirth. By living in a subjective state of steady identification with the self, it has to be consciously removed. That which is the annihilation of the vasanas here and now is called liberation, and annihilation of the vasanas here and now is called liberation by the sages. And then 268, so it ties very nicely with self-inquiry. I and mine, this notion in the body, sense organs, etc., which are the not self, this superimposition, the wise, must end by identification with the self. 269, realizing your innermost self as the witness of the intellect and its disturbances, and ever maintaining the thought that I am, shed your identification with the not self. So these are three verses that seem to tie nicely with Bhagavan Ramana's teachings on self-inquiry. But I'd love to hear your comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Suresh. Thank you. So were they three consecutive verses?
Yes.
And can you remind me of the number of the first verse, please?
267.
So 267, 268, 269 from Vivekachudamani.
Right.
Okay. And as you said, Suresh, thank you for saying this. It is on that is one of the texts on my recommended reading list. It is a traditional Advaita Vedanta text. It was written by Shankara, maybe 1500 years ago. Now, the first of those verses you read is actually quite a contentious verse in some ways. I don't know if you're aware of that, Suresh, when you read it, because some people have used this. Most people think that this text, Vivekachudamani, which since it was written, has been praised as being an amazing text that elucidates all the major teachings of the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita in one small, pithy volume, concise volume. And people speak of the text Vivekachudamani as if it's like the instruction manual, or dare I say it, the Bible of Vedanta. You know, the word Bible doesn't just mean the Christian Bible in nowadays. You can say it's a Bible, meaning it's kind of the definitive guide. And so Vivekachudamani is, in this sense, like the definitive, being considered to be a definitive guide for Vedanta. Shankara set up 4 centers of learning in India, 4 different parts of India. And in all these 4 centers, Vivekachudamani is hailed as a very important text written by Shankara. And traditionally, people have ascribed great importance to it for around about 1.5 millennia. But there's some people who don't, the teachings are very clear in Vivekachudamani. How many verses are there in Vivekachudamani, Suresh? You're about halfway through. They're about, is it just under 600 verses, I think?
Yeah, five. This text that I have has 581.
581 verses in Vivekachudamani. So you can see the verses that you've quoted, Suresh, are about halfway through the text. They're about halfway through the text. And many Vedanta teachings will end at around, those kind of verses. So the second half of the text is really elucidating the main aspect of the Vedanta teachings. Sorry about that. So these verses are from roughly halfway through the text. And so many people now, it's mainly a 20th century thing. Because traditionally, the belief in Vivekachudamani and other texts have been so strong that any dissidents have been they've not been taken too seriously. Whereas in the 20th century, what's happened, and going on into the current 21st century, what's happened is there have been these bookish Vedanta scholars who know all the scriptures off by heart, and they're very learned in the Sanskrit and the words, but they don't like the teachings in these texts, especially the second half of these texts, like Vivekachudamani. And so they try to say, oh, Vivekachudamani was not written by Shankara. And this is one of the verses they use to show why Shankara would never have given this teaching. Because what Shankara is saying in verse, do you say it was 267? Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you read verse 267 again? And then I'll explain it, just to remind everybody else. And then I'll explain it, why people use this verse against Shankara. And hopefully the fact that I've said it's halfway through the text and a bit of context I've given there will help you understand why he's written it like this.
Even after the realization of truth, there remains a powerful, beginningless, deep vasana that one is the doer and the enjoyer, which is the cause for rebirth.
Can we stop there, Suresh, please?
Yeah.
Thank you. So the verse is saying, even after self-realization, the vasana remains, a strong vasana remains, that I am the doer, I am the thinker, I am the actor. Which means that is essentially the vasana, I am the body-mind. Do you see? So in this verse, Shankara is saying, even after realization of the self, there is this tendency to identify as a person, as the doer, as the thinker. And if you carry on, Suresh, carry on.
By living in the subjective state of steady identification with the self, it has to be consciously removed.
And if we could stop again, please. So he's saying, look, even after you've realized the self, this identification with the body-mind as being a doer still remains. So you need to practice identification with the self, which is self-inquiry. It's translated as identification with the self, but what it refers to in this context, as it's explained in the second half of the text, is self-inquiry. And then the last, I think there's one more sentence in this verse, isn't there? And that clarifies the whole of the verse. If you read the last sentence, Suresh, please.
That which is the annihilation of the vasanas here and now is called liberation by the sages.
Yes, so this is a very famous line. That which is annihilation of the vasanas here and now is moksha, liberation. The word used in this verse, I remember, is moksha, because it's a very famous verse. And it's often used by people who don't like this text, Vivekachudamani. I should say one of the reasons that people don't like the text Vivekachudamani is because it says you need to go within to realize the self. And people don't want to go within to realize the self. People want to realize the self without going within. And not only does it say you need to go within to realize the self, it says you need to do self-inquiry. Right at the beginning of the text and throughout the text, it says you need to do self-inquiry. It's the only way. Vichara, the word used is vichara. You need to do vichara, self-inquiry, short for atma vichara, to realize the self. And not only does this text say that, it then says you need to go to nirvikalpa samadhi. It means you need to turn within until the body, mind, world no longer appears, to realize the self, which is exactly the same as what Bhagavan Ramana writes in Who Am I? In the first few paragraphs of Who Am I, Bhagavan Ramana says the same thing. And Bhagavan Ramana has written a beautiful introduction to Vivekachudamani, which is not in the collected works, but there's a copy of it on tomdas.com, which I highly recommend people look at if they're interested. And it explains the teachings of Vivekachudamani. And Bhagavan has said that these teachings summarize all the essential Vedanta teachings and tell us everything we need for the path to liberation. Because Bhagavan Ramana translated the entire text from Sanskrit into Tamil. But back to this verse. The first sentence in this verse, 267, the first sentence says, even when you have realized the self, there still is a tendency for ignorance, right? People following that? Now, and then the second sentence says, therefore, you must practice self-inquiry. And then the third sentence says, once all the vasanas have been removed, that is moksha. Now, can anybody see the discrepancy here? Because if you have realized the self, how can there be any ignorance left? You see? And isn't self-realization the same as moksha? Because what it seems like this verse is saying is that you can realize the self, but ignorance is still there. You've got to do this other practice to remove the ignorance, to remove the vasana. And then when you've removed all the vasanas, that's moksha, liberation. So it seems like Shankara here in this verse is saying there's something different between self-realization in the first sentence and moksha in the last sentence. Do you see? The Upanishads, which are kind of the definitive source material for Vedanta. Vedanta teachings are based upon, well, they actually come from within the heart of the sage. But for the pundits, for the scholars, they come from the Upanishads. The Upanishads are actually nothing but the teachings that spontaneously spring forth from the self-realized sage, the self. But people in the Upanishads, it says time and time again, that once you have realized the self, there's nothing else needed to do. That's it. That's the end of your journey. So they say this cannot be written by Shankara, because Shankara has said after you've realized the self, you've still got more work to do. Do you see? So what I think, my interpretation of this verse is that there are many people who think they've realized the self when they get to the halfway point of Vivekachudamani, when they get to the teachings. At the halfway point of Vivekachudamani, the teachings basically are everything you can perceive, all objects are non-self, and what you are is the subject self. So many people realize that and think, oh, I'm liberated. And what Shankara is saying is that you may have realized that, but you haven't done self-inquiry yet. You need to go towards the I am first to root out any vasanas that make you identify as the doer or the thinker or the body mind, And only when all the vasanas are rooted out is that truly moksha. That's my interpretation. And I think the only logical interpretation of that verse, given that we're halfway through the text. And the second half of the text is all about how we need to turn within and attain the nirvikalpa state. Nirvikalpa state means the self. If you don't want to read the whole text, you can read Bhagavan Ramana's introduction to the text, where he summarizes the entire teaching in a few pages. I would still recommend you read the entire text because the teachings are unfolded and given in a very clear and direct way. And repeatedly, the texts are, the teaching is repeated again and again throughout the entire text, in the beginning, the middle, and the end. And what this means is that you can't just distort or wrongly translate one or two of the verses and think you can change the teaching. So say you want to reinterpret one or two of the verses because you're trying to distort the teachings because you think you know better than the text, or you think you have the true understanding of the text. If you distort one or two of the verses, because there's so many repetitions, the true meaning of the text will still come through, unless you rewrite pretty much the entire text. There's a relatively famous Vedanta teacher who's now passed away, whose Vedanta teachings are very, very popular, very influential. And when he translated Vivekachudamani, what he did, he missed out all the verses that he didn't agree with, which was over half of the verses. Yeah. And he only translated the verses that he liked. And then he said he was just picking the most essential of all the verses. I think he picked out 108 verses, and 108 is a traditional holy number. And he missed out, and he said, these are the most important verses. Well, luckily, someone else also picked out all of the most important verses. I think, I don't know, 6, 10, 12, I can't remember how many verses. And this is our beloved Bhagavan Ramana. He picked out, and again, you can find this on tomdas.com. You won't find it in the collected works, where Bhagavan chose what he felt were the most important verses in Vivekachudamani. And lo and behold, I haven't cross-referenced, but I know many of the verses that he picked are not in this other person's selection of 108 or so most important verses. So this first verse basically means he might have had some kind of realization. We'll tentatively call it self-realization. But if there remains a tendency to identify as the doer, then you need to do self-inquiry for longer. The next two verses, as far as I recall, Suresh, you can correct me if I'm wrong, just basically say, do more self-inquiry. I think that's basically what they say. Is that right? If you could read the 268, 269.
Yeah. So 268, I and mine, this notion in the body, sense organs, etc., which are the not self, this superimposition, the wise must end by identification with the self. And 269.
Well, if we stop there a second, Suresh, please. So that verse is basically saying the idea of I and the idea of mine is a part of Maya, what they call superimposition. Superimposition means objects. It means you've got a clear, objectless, formless consciousness. And then into that are superimposed things, which are called objects and ideas. And these two things, the idea of an I, the idea of a mine, are objects in the mental space. And Shankara is saying, do not identify with them, identify with the subject. Now that word identify again is misinterpreted, because people then think the teaching is just to repeat, I am that, I am that, I am Brahman, I am Brahman, I'm the subject, I'm the subject. But the way, I'm not sure about the translation of the word identify, but it's really to be the self. And again, this is made clearer as the text is unfolded. Please carry on, Suresh.
So verse 269, realizing your innermost self as the witness of the intellect, and its disturbances, and ever maintaining the thought that I am, shed your identification with the not self. Realizing the innermost self as the witness of the intellect and its disturbances, and ever maintaining the thought that I am, shed your identification with the not self.
Yes, thank you, Suresh. So again, this is the beginning of this. These verses are just starting off this second half of the text. So it's saying, recognize the self as the subject, the witness. It's not the body, it's not the mind, not the intellect, not your feelings, not your thoughts, not your concepts, not your ideas. It's that which witnesses them. So conceive of the self as the witness and identify as that. Later, we'll discover the self is not a witness because the objects are unreal. So there's nothing to witness in realization. This is explained right towards the end. So here, in the early part of Vivekachudamani, the self is conceived of as being a witness. But later we'll discover that self is not a witness. And here it is encouraged for us to conceive or think, I am that. But later we'll discover that there's no thinking involved. It's actually self-inquiry that is being prescribed. Was that your understanding of these verses as well, Suresh? Or do you have anything you want to add or anything you want to ask that I haven't covered?
I felt it aligned very nicely with the process of self-inquiry, ultimately pointing to something beyond thought and time. But paradoxically, there still is a process.
Yeah. There appears to be a process, and we talk as if there's a process, and we encourage a process. But when realization happens, we realize there was never a process. This is the paradox.
Yeah. But I didn't find any conflict with Bhagwan's teachings and your explanations.
Can you see the potential conflicts with that first verse?
I can see the potential conflicts, yes.
Did you notice that? Did you notice that when you read it?
Yes, initially I did, yes. The first line.
Yes.
It
says after you've realized the self.
Right.
But then the last line of that first verse you read, 267, says only when the vasanas are totally eradicated. And vasana, that's called vasana kashaya. Vasana kashaya means annihilation or elimination of vasanas. That's the text, that's the line, I believe, in that verse.
Right. Yeah, can.
Yeah.
Tom, my wife wants to say something.
Yes.
In the Sanskrit is jnate vastuni api palavati vasana nadi resha, so it's meaning having known the self, but jnate can be an intellectual knowledge. So it's after intellectually knowing about the self, but the vasanas remain and sadhana is required.
Exactly. That's it.
For
Thank you.
moksha, mukti. Yeah. And the last line is mukti.
Oh, mukti. Thank you. Mukti. It must be a different, there must be a, because there's lots of repetition in the text, there must be another line where they talk about it in a similar way, where it's vasana kashaya and then moksha. They use the word moksha. But thank you for correcting me. I appreciate that. So it's mukti they use here. Mukti is a synonym for moksha.
Yeah,
Mukti means
same
liberation. Moksha also means liberation.
Right.
And thank you for points. The problem we have, and again, the problem we have with the Vedanta scriptures, and with Shankara's writing, we have the same issue, and the Upanishads, we have the same issue, is that the same words, and in Bhagavan's writings, we have the same issue, by the way, and the way I speak, we have the same issue, is that the words are not always used precisely. Same word, sometimes the word knowledge is used to mean knowledge of Maya, intellectual knowledge. Sometimes the word knowledge is used to mean self-knowledge. And this is almost inevitable because of the natural, spontaneous way the teachings emerge. They don't emerge from a scientifically orientated, definition-orientated mind. The teachings come spontaneously. It's like more like artistic or poetic creation rather than a very contrived scientific language. So we have to we shouldn't take everything too literally. The other reason these words are not always accurate is because we're talking about something that ultimately cannot be expressed in words. So often words are used in a variety of ways in order to give a sense of a meaning. But yes, I agree that probably the first sentence probably means even when the self is intellectually known. But again, we will see the same words used for intellectual knowledge and self-knowledge all the time.
Right.
And some people like to say how wonderful the Sanskrit language is because there's lots of nuance and the words are used in very particular ways, in a way that the English language hasn't really developed to describe these things. And there's some truth to that. There's certainly some words in Sanskrit and some concepts in Sanskrit that don't have English equivalents. But anybody who's waded through the variety of Sanskrit texts will know that Sanskrit is not used in a precise way, consistently. And it shouldn't surprise you because these texts were written over a period of thousands and thousands of years. So it shouldn't surprise you that a text written 1,000 years ago uses the words in a slightly different way to a text written 2,000 years ago. And that's written in a slightly different way to a text written 3,000 years ago, because the use changes. Even within the text, you get inconsistencies of how we use the words. So even the word Atman, which we say means the self, the true self, in some verses, it means the jiva, the I, the ego. So we have this issue. We have to understand the context.
Right.
Thank you, Suresh.
Thank you, Tom.
And I can't remember your wife's name, but thank you to you as well.
Vilasini.
Alasani. Oh, I didn't think I know that.
Vilasini. Vilasini.
Vilasani.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.